everybody. Welcome to another round of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons, and I am truly delighted that you are listening to these conversations. I hope you enjoy them. Today's guest is someone who talks about popular culture. I'm very excited to bring this conversation to you because, popular culture is such a shat upon subject in most of academia, besides, the fields of American studies, maybe film studies, and in English you can do a lot of that work. But certainly in the discipline I came from in graduate school, which is history, there was kind of a resistance and a skepticism about studying popular culture or reading any kind of historical or cultural or political meaning from those texts. I actually had a professor in graduate school who will go unnamed, who said something so insane in class. I remember writing it down. He said, he or she said that the television has had no impact on the direction of American history, and I thought that was so incredibly absurd. But at the same time, very representative of certain attitudes among certain academics. That pop culture is just kind of like some crass, outside. Crass piece of culture outside of what really deserves study. My guest today obviously does not believe that, and thank God for people like her, because, for me, reading culture and what people are consuming and why they're consuming it and how it's produced and why it's produced and what the, kind of ideological currents are working underneath all of that stuff is really, really, really important to decoding what's going on in our world and moving the whole human project forward. So I'll stand up for the study of popular culture. If anybody needs me at conferences, I charge pretty reasonable rates to defend and justify the study of pop culture. But my guest today is a professor of English literature at LaGuardia Community College, our old favorite LaGuardia, which is an awesome school for a million different reasons. But her name is Jayashree Kamble. She is a professor who has written quite a bit about the romance novel and romance fiction, which is a genre I know many of us are very familiar with, yet know very little about. I think most of us are familiar with kind of the covers of these romance novels. The Fabio thing, obviously, is something that comes to mind as an icon. But Jayashree has studied this stuff on a much deeper level. She actually reads these books. She's a fan of these books, and she describes kind of her history with them and how she went from being a kind of fan of these books to someone who's really taking apart and confronting the kind of ideological ideas that are at the core of them. So I had a fascinating conversation with her. She told me about what it was like to grow up in India, what the culture of education in India was, and how she made the decision to move to Minnesota from India to go to graduate school, and kind of her path in finding a place talking about not only romance fiction, but the trends in popular culture that tell us a lot about the way we feel about race, the way we feel about gender, the way we feel about class. She's got kind of a Michel Foucault reading of a lot of this stuff, so she knows her theoretical stuff much more than I do, and explains it quite well. She was amazing to talk to. I really had a great time with her, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. There are many more episodes to download and find on iTunes. You can go to nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com. You can like the Facebook page and get updates on new episodes and new stuff. And of course, maybe the easiest way to get Nostalgia Trap episodes onto your device is to go to Stitcher.com and download their app, and you can put all the episodes on there, and it's all free and will always be free. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is me talking to Professor Jayashree Kamble. What made you find your way from Bombay to Minnesota? Those seem like very different places. I'm going to push this a little bit towards you.
Yeah. to be perfectly honest, it was a completely scattershot model. I knew I wanted to study abroad somewhere. And I think around the time that I was thinking about applying to grad schools, the logical place seemed to be was to go to Britain, because I had the English lit background. It seemed that's where you should go, but funding had been clamped down. And in Britain, this was under Tony Brown. And so there was someone in my hometown in Pune, which is about 100 miles away from Bombay, who was helping students. He runs a business, helping students to go abroad. And he said, well, I can tell you about the U.S. I don't know anything about Britain. And he suggested that in the humanities there was, in fact, enough funding that I could actually not have to take out any debt or anything like that. He said Indians usually think about engineering and sciences and things like that. But
STEM.
He said, there's the STEM stuff, but there's stuff for you in the humanities if you want to do an English PhD program. And so I sort of worked with him, and we narrowed down, which schools to try to apply to. And Minnesota was really sort of a random choice. People said, oh, it's a good school, it's highly ranked. I would ask people, what does that mean? And nobody could quite explain to me why certain things are highly ranked versus another. So I had sort of, honestly, it was like darts on a map. And the couple of places accepted me, one here, one in Florida. And when I asked people which one, and people said, oh, Minnesota, you should go there. And so
that's amazing.
Essentially how
Minnesota versus Florida. I mean, when you think about the stereotypes of those two states. Can I ask you a little bit about growing up in India, and you mentioned the natural place would be Britain, and I imagine you're right. You write a little bit about colonialism and the ideas around there. What was the relationship to Britain in the imagination when you were young, if there was any at all?
Almost none, actually. Because India became independent in 1947, and so my generation is a couple of generations removed from the Midnight's Children generation. And so Britain actually had been eclipsed by the United States in terms of popular culture, or as standing in for any kind of Western civilization.
Okay, that makes sense.
So though growing up, I don't know that I was very clear about the distinctions. Everything was English language popular culture. We didn't really make any distinctions between something that came from Britain versus the U.S. versus Australia. It all seemed to be this is something that's English language programming.
That's interesting, because Americans don't think of that way. They're we have us and then people with accents. That's
So Britain sort of. It wasn't really relevant in any way. I mean, in our history books, it's, here's our freedom struggle, here's all that we did to get away from them. But there's no animosity. There's, the people play cricket. That's still the binding force.
It feels like there's still a kind of cultural remnant that's still a little bit there. So, growing up in India, what was your relationship to education? Did you feel, because it sounds like education was very, very important to you, but how did that happen? Was that something that was encouraged by your family, or how did you end up taking such an academic road?
I mean, education really is very key, I think, in India in general, because it's been really pushed as the way out of poverty. This is the thing you have to do. So you can go to the smallest villages and the slums and the urban neighborhoods, and people are really pushing for their kids to go to school. So that's generally in the air, that people really want their kids to get an education. With my particular family, we have a very specific possibly very interesting history. So I belong to a community whose ancestors were labeled as part of the untouchable caste. So it's the fifth caste in Hinduism. And in somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement, an equivalent to it. So Dr. Ambedkar, the man who actually wrote the Indian Constitution, was part of our community. And so he really pushed hard for change and sort of pushed hard against the caste system. And part of his whole thing was education, that we have to get educated because untouchables were deprived of education. You couldn't go to schools. Traditionally, of course, you weren't allowed to be literate. You weren't allowed to hear the Vedas. You were not allowed access. Right? All of that was forbidden. So he really pushed hard for education. And so that's part of my sort of community's memory and legacy and sort of political belief that you have to get an education. My dad grew up under his influence a lot, under Dr. Ambedkar's influence. So it was my father's push as well.
It's interesting to me ideologically, because it sounds like it's it doesn't seem to have the same kind of like competitive tinge as like the American, like educate yourself, pull yourself up by a bootstrap kind of thing, so that you can compete in the marketplace.
Right.
It seemed more about like cultural improvement.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And my father, I don't know if he would have identified himself as such, but he, I think, had more socialist and Marxist inclinations.
Okay. Yeah,
so it certainly was not about competing in the marketplace. It really was about, we have to gain knowledge because without it, we have been powerless.
Yeah.
And we've been, treated like animals. So you have to educate yourself. This is part of your sort of responsibility to yourself and your future generations. So,
So it sounds like you had that kind of class idea internalized pretty early in your life.
Very early, we were definitely sort of growing up with that notion that this is something that we had to take on, that we had to do. My father and his siblings, my mother and her siblings, they were sort of the first generation to even move into college.
Yeah.
So it was something that was really aspirational, and people were pushing that we had to do it. But the community struggles, and so we have similar struggles that you'll see to oppressed minorities in other places. So it's a constant challenge. So people are, a lot will fall behind.
Yeah.
And then so there's, it's a narrative that doesn't end. Like we're constantly being told that we have to get somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Join the rest of us, kind of thing. You know what I mean? That was so weird. When you moved to the United States, what was that like for you leaving India? Was it the first time you had left India, or had you been somewhere else?
No, it was the first time I'd left India. It was the first time I'd been on a plane.
And how long ago was this?
In 2000.
Okay.
So it's been 14 years. Yeah. And so I flew to the Twin Cities when I went to graduate school, and it was different, but. Salman Rushdie, he talks about how globalization is this interesting phenomenon where it's harder sometimes for someone within the same country to move from the countryside to the city than it is for people to move from one metropolis to another across national boundaries.
That makes sense to me.
And I think that was actually the interesting moment where I made the shift, and it was fine because in some ways I had been culturally indoctrinated already to American culture. So parts of it didn't feel very different at all. I was like, okay.
I know what this looks like.
This is how it is. But in many ways, Minneapolis, which is a great town, is also, it's not New York City. Right, so I was more used to the equivalent of New York City because of Bombay than
Minneapolis
I was.
isn't a super bustling metropolis in the way that New York is.
It's not crushingly crowded. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a great compromise. I actually think it's a great place to stay. But it was different. When my family once came to visit, for example, they would keep remarking on the fact that they could go an entire block and there was nobody on the sidewalk.
Yes, yeah.
That was sort of unnerving. And I think for me it was too, but when you go to a new place for school, you kind of get caught up in its own little micro environment. So I think it wasn't such a huge culture shock or anything like that.
And I imagine it was a pretty cosmopolitan campus.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's lots of international students, even the folks who are local are very friendly.
Yeah.
And so, it wasn't alienating in that sense. But there's still the natural sort of shifts that you go through, right? Like our international office gave us an actual graph where they charted how you're going to be like, you super euphoric at the beginning, and then you get the first dip of homesickness, then it sort of goes away for a while, and then there's a second dip of homesickness. Like the 5
stages of grief, basically. Yeah.
Exactly so.
Yeah, I think I went through that a little bit just coming to New York City, and it's funny because I went through the process you just described, which is coming from a small place and going to New York City, and the culture shock being tremendous.
Right.
And that, there is a sense that if I could easily make it in London right now, and the times I've gone over to Western Europe, those big cities, it's very like if you run a subway in Washington D.C., you can ride the one in Madrid.
Exactly,
and it's pretty simple.
Yeah,
it's almost horrifying in the sense that I think I saw a picture of someone on Facebook that was in Saudi Arabia, and they were out at some mall, and the mall looked exactly the same as the mall in like my hometown.
Right.
Kind of like. It was disturbing because it's just like the same stores and everything. I was like, wait, where is the unique culture here?
Exactly.
Yeah. So how did you find America from coming from India? Like there's such like I don't know, America is such occupies such a powerful place in the world's imagination.
Yeah.
Did you feel like a sense of this isn't what I thought it would be, or in terms of the culture and the people?
Yeah. It certainly sort of felt different in many ways. I think Minnesota has its own culture.
Yes. Yeah.
So
well, the Midwest in general.
The Midwest, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was not the America in some ways that I thought, because most of what you see of America in the movies is New York or LA. Mm-hmm. So you have a very specific understanding. And for me, growing up in like 80s cinema, watching movies like Splash or whatever, there's a very clear aesthetic there that is organized by the studios. And so it clearly wasn't that. But you hear that Americans are very friendly, and I found that to be true.
Yes.
It used to unnerve me sometimes because growing up female and in India and in Bombay, you sort of have all these things about public and private space because you're so crowded close together that you don't make eye contact, that even when you're in a crowded train, you pretend that you're not touching each other, right? All of those little barriers that you create. Whereas in Minnesota, like random strangers would want to say hi, the bus drivers would want to talk to me, and I would be thinking, why is this guy talking to me? Like, what is going on?
Like asking questions. So what are you doing today?
Right.
He's just very defensive.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was that was actually a little bit confusing for me to negotiate before. I thought, this is a completely benign, completely open conversation that we're trying to have here.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. The food was really weird. Like I'd go to a grocery store and there'd be like a packaged hamburger. I was like, that is so bizarre. Like the whole thing has been put in a plastic.
Even the bun.
Even the bun. I was
right.
like, and then you microwave it. What a bizarre idea.
It is bizarre. I still think that stuff is bizarre.
Yeah. I remember eating a McDonald's burger for the first time, I think probably a year or two into my stay, and finding it absolutely revolting. And I couldn't understand why.
Yeah. I think if you don't grow up with that being shoved in your face since you're a little child, which is what McDonald's wants, right? The kind of like womb to tomb service of Ronald McDonald. If you don't grow up with it, it's gross.
Right. It was weird. Yeah.
I took a long break from McDonald's, and I don't think I could go back.
Especially when you eat like real hamburgers.
Yeah, it would have to be a desperate moment that returned me to Ronald McDonald's arms. So American culture, it seems like you ended up engaging in American culture very heavily in your work, and not just American culture, but popular culture. I want to hear about like how you came to that. Did you come to Minnesota and the university thinking that that's what you were going to pursue, or what was in your mind when you came to get a degree in America?
Yeah, it wasn't actually. I hadn't thought about popular culture, at least not what I do now. My personal statement when I'd written to the university was actually about Shakespeare and cinema. So I thought those were the things I was going to study. And again, that's a very sort of traditional English literature, growing up under the former empire kind of idea, right? Like you study Shakespeare, that's where all the cultural capital lies.
Yes.
That's supposed to be the best thing for you to do. And I love
still
Shakespeare.
Exists a little bit, right?
Absolutely, it's still around. And I love Shakespeare, and I was, it was not an insincere desire to study it. I had very good teachers in high school who had taught me well. So that's what I had planned to do. I thought I would go and I would study Shakespeare. And
Shakespeare in the movies, in the sense that like movies that are like adaptations of Shakespeare?
I hadn't thought about the intersection. So the statement really had been, I'm interested in cinema and I'm interested in Shakespeare. And I think I had a vague idea that I would somehow find a way to get those two to dovetail. Maybe through adaptations or something.
Because I was going to ask you if you've seen Julie Taymor's Titus.
I have not. I've heard a lot about it.
Yeah, that film is like, I can't speak for Julie Taymor's Spider-Man thing, but that film is something else. And I just remember when you said Shakespeare in film, I remember a review of Titus that was like in the DVD, the very prestigious DVD. And it said something along the lines of like, if Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be making films. Like that would be, he was a pop culture kind of guy.
He was always playing to the gallery. He liked that. Absolutely. It wasn't what we do now, which is the stuffy Shakespeare.
I mean, it has all the sex and violence and drama and all that stuff in it that we love.
Exactly.
So I think that that's probably what happened to you is probably true for many of us, in that we wrote personal statements like, this is what I'm going to do, and you ended up not doing that. So what was the turn for you?
Yeah, so I'd been in my program for a couple years, and I was TAing for a professor who was a Spencer scholar, but also a Shakespeare scholar. It was like an early British survey class. And I was talking to him about how I was trying to shape my project. I wasn't quite sure if it was what I wanted to do. And he said, well, you should write your dissertation on the things that you read even when you don't have to. And that's almost a direct quote. Yeah. And I read romance novels. Like I read them all the time. It was something I did for pleasure. I never sort of looked down on them or anything like that.
We got to press pause. Where does that come from? The romance novel. When did you start reading those?
So
And what is a romance novel?
So in India, when you grow up in India, you're surrounded by little circulating libraries and little shops that have an extra thing that they do selling paperbacks.
Yeah.
And again, as part of our legacy of the British Empire, there are these tiny 180-page books, which in the U.S. now are recognized by the name of Harlequin.
Or dime novels a little bit.
Dime novels even precedes even
I'm
the
thinking of like the 19th
right,
century.
Yeah, but yeah, it's the same thing, right? It's paperback. It's treated as pulp. It's
not considered literature,
right? In certain
serious literature,
yeah, exactly,
yeah,
right,
among the literati,
right. Mm-hmm. But it was a British company called Mills and Boon that was publishing these books and has been doing them since about 1908.
Oh wow!
And they're everywhere in the empire. The former empire, you'll find them in Australia, you'll find them in India, and they're so ubiquitous, and the brand was so powerful that they built up that you won't even say romance novel, you'll say a Mills and Boon. Like it's actually referred to by that.
So is it all one story with the same characters in it?
No, the genre is very sort of strictly formulated.
Okay.
So they used to have tip sheets for their writers and things like that, where you like the boy and girl meet and then they fall in love or they have a conflict and there's an obstacle and so forth. So there's a larger underlying mythic structure to it.
Yeah.
But they're different characters. They're not connected.
Okay.
But
you kind of know what you're getting when you buy the
right,
brand.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that's why you're looking for a Mills and Boon, or you're reading a Mills and Boon novel. And so those were the books that I started reading. And the story that most people in my position will tell you that they found those books in their home because their older sisters were reading them or their cousins were reading them, and so they sort of pass in the second economy that sort of circulates, and you'll find them at these used bookstores and circulating libraries.
It's all culture
that's
around
where,
it.
Yeah, that's where I picked it up. Yeah.
So you were reading those for just enjoyment. Where it seems like you have a critical mind. Were there moments when you were reading these things that where you're kind of like reading the ideology already underneath them, or is that something that, because it sounds like that was this moment in graduate school where someone told you should study what you read when you're not studying. How'd you make that connection? Was that the first time? It couldn't have been the first time you thought like these novels have something beyond just entertainment value.
Right. Well, that actually goes back to a moment with some other graduate students where we were sharing. It was some sort of writing group, I think. And one of my friends in the English program had written a paper on the TV show Friends. Yeah. And she was analyzing how strongly capitalist it was in terms of the way it constantly talked about brands, right? So like there's an episode on Pottery Barn, there's an episode on some sort of jeans, I guess. And that was the moment when I sort of realized, I was like, oh, I guess you could do this stuff. Yeah. That you can take an object of popular culture and actually subject it to the same kind of ideological questioning.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, so my professor's remark in her paper sort of made me start to think about it as
you
an
can realize how much power it has when you realize that, oh my God, Friends is propaganda, and then realizing that like everybody I know loves that show.
Right.
And like it was just in the news yesterday that like, oh, Friends is going to be on Netflix, and there was like this universal rejoicing, and I was like wanted to scream like, does anyone remember how terrible this show was? Like the values were awful, but anyway. So that must have been exciting to like kind of realize that I could study romance novels.
Yeah, it was. And it was interesting because initially at least, I couldn't find anybody to work with me on them, even though it's a huge university, so it took some digging around to try to find the people who might be able to help me out, because there wasn't anybody who was a romance fiction scholar, not at my university, nor that, as far as I could tell, anywhere else. I had a hard time finding work that had been written on it, and part of it is because it didn't exist as a field then. It was there, but it was all scattered, so it was actually hard to find material.
I'm guessing you would find people doing that kind of stuff in like American Studies departments.
Exactly.
And things like that.
Yeah. I mean, Janice Radway is the one that people always talk about, who wrote Reading the Romance. It's been about 25 years now. And yeah, I think she was American Studies. And so there are people who did it in American Studies and Culture Studies, but of course nobody in like literature departments.
Yeah, right.
Straight up was looking at anything like that.
That kind of disciplinary intransigence to that kind of study.
Yeah.
So as you moved along, what are these? Did you just study this particular brand of romance novels from India, or did you end up studying more like a wider kind of swath of the genre?
Yeah, I did a huge swath, which was I think disciplinarily problematic because I was trying to say overarching things about things that are really not all that uniform, right? So my initial step was thinking, they're all romance novels, but they're not. The ones that came out of Britain are very different from the ones that started coming out of the U.S. in the 70s, which were very different from the ones coming out of the U.S. in the 80s and then the 90s. So they really
it's not monolithic.
It's not monolithic at all. So initially, at least, the wide sweep was what I did, and because I felt somehow that nobody else was writing about it, so I have to say every possible thing that people have gotten wrong about them. So my dissertation,
trailblazing at that point.
Yeah, very badly so, but yeah. So the dissertation ended up being very scattershot. Like I was doing ideological stuff, so I look at like capitalism and war and heterosexuality, but I also had a chapter where I studied pages and pages of stuff I'd printed out that were message boards that readers were using at that time online. So I was like trying to do like discourse analysis. At the same time, like I was really interested in the covers because so much of the bad press that romance novels get is based on the covers that people
there's a lot to unpack there.
Represent them. So I had like a chapter on covers. So yeah, I was trying to like address sort of interdisciplinary issues sometimes and things I had no training in. Also trying to do a chronological study to show that they started in 1908, and so things that you say about them now don't actually apply to the stuff in the past. You have to have a historical
There was
view.
a whole century of history overlaying that.
Right, yeah.
So in general, I mean, what did you find that these romance novels are about? What do they reveal to us?
Again, it really does shift. So if you look at the stuff that's in Britain from pre-war times, from pre-World War II, they're very different. Their protagonists are oftentimes working class protagonists. They're like shop girls and clerks and things like that.
Yeah.
And so their romances function on a very small scale in a way. Whereas if you move post-war and you start to look at like the Reagan and Thatcher years, that's a very different understanding. So they are very strongly attuned to the economic moment. And so you suddenly start to get like heroes who are millionaires and they have yachts, and the women are still sort of trying to work their way up through the professional classes, but the men are the ones who sort of control all the money, and it's very much a sort of a weird trickle down economic sort of affecting some of those texts. You start to see the impact of like the feminist movement, the second wave. You start to see
how do you see that expressing itself, the second wave feminism in these romance novels? Because you think of these romance novels, I mean, I don't think I've ever read them. I've only looked at their covers, and their covers are actually really striking. I mean, there's nothing like them in the culture really, besides these kind of like shirtless men holding these women on a horse kind of thing.
Yeah.
But like, what is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the second wave, in some ways, it comes after the beginning of the genre.
Yeah.
Right. The genre's got already about 40 or 50 years on it at that
right.
point. And I think second wave feminism is interesting because the genre is definitely reacting to it, because it really does believe very strongly, at least in terms of its text, in the idea of the couple.
Yes.
Right? It believes that that is a unit for happiness, that is actually something that's valuable. So it's interested in that idea. And I think different authors react to it differently. So you'll definitely see some who are sort of entrenching themselves in that narrative and resisting anything that will sort of oppose that. But by and large, the genre is really aware that you cannot just endorse the idea of the couple blindly, and you certainly cannot endorse a 50s or pre-50s ideal anymore.
Interesting.
And so you see a fair amount of sort of combativeness in the couple's interaction. A lot of the times you'll see at the end of the text, the author's trying really hard to convince you that this will work out, that the happy ending will in fact be one that lasts forever. But if you look at the message boards, people will be sort of arguing about a lot of these texts and saying, I don't know, like it seemed like they had a terrible dynamic, the guy has way too much power, why would she be happy with him? So I think the conversations start to impact the way the books are read and written. I mean,
would you describe these books as kind of like prescriptive texts for like heterosexual monogamy? Are they kind of meant to teach a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's certainly some element of that, or used to be.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think especially probably the books that were coming out, I'd say in the early post-war period in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
There's definitely an element of like, this is how you're happy with the person of the opposite sex, right? Like these are the compromises you make. These are the ways you try to interpret their behavior.
These are the elements that make happiness.
Right.
Yeah.
This is how you teach each other how to communicate, so there is certainly, I think, an element of that. But part of the work that I was doing was trying to sort of actually tease out how much they're aware of the gay rights movement. And what does that mean? Like, does the queer narrative ever sort of come into the text?
Does it?
I think it does in a very oblique way. I think that so in the late 70s and early 80s, you see the rise in the text of like the really powerful rise of what's called the alpha male hero. And that's actually a coinage that's a little bit older. The British Mills and Boon, one of the editors, coined that term, where the man is like super aggressively heterosexual.
Yeah.
Like there's no doubt that he's straight,
It's a macho
right?
man.
Like he's so straight that
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
To the extent that it sometimes, to me, it seems like it gets expressed as a potential rapist. Right? Like he's a sexual threat
Yeah.
to the heroine, and to some, I read that as a sort of reaction to the gay rights movement, to sort of saying, no, it's not that all men are queer.
Yes. Yes,
like there's
right.
still the straight man, and so they have to sort of.
There's still a virulent.
Exactly. Yeah, you have to really make that idea very clear, sort of reassure people.
Are there gay romance novels? I mean, it seems like there's got to be a whole genre of that, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And certainly, of course, there have been queer texts forever.
Yes.
And definitely in the 20th century. But for a long time, it was like lesbian pulp, especially in the pre-war.
Right.
In the 50s. But yeah, now there's like mainstream queer texts, both like male, and female romance novels. And some of that has been aided, and I'm not an expert on this, but has been aided by the rise of the ebook industry.
Okay.
So there were a couple of e-publishers who really started to sort of have authors who were interested in writing queer texts, and they made sure that the work got out. And it's gotten, I think, a lot more readership. And I think the readership itself now is not confined to the queer community. That read
that's
by
what I was
both
thinking.
straight and gay readers. Yeah.
So what is happening to the novel? Because there's so much talk about like this. The novel is dead or print is dead. And all this kind of like rush at like
right.
for me, I'm kind of annoyed by that. Some of that because of the internet, and none of us know what is happening. I think we'll look back and see that we're in a period of like chaotic flux.
Yeah.
But do you think the novel still holds such a powerful place in the culture?
I think so. In fact, a few years ago when I was in my graduate program, one of my professors had suggested to me that like any other form, the novel will die. And I remember sort of having my mind blown by that idea and thought, no, that's crazy. Like, how will it die? So I think it's a very powerful force. I think as a narrative mode, people really like it. I think whether it's an electronic form or actual paper form doesn't really change the fact that it can still exist as it does. So I think the novel, at least the way certain theorists think about it, like Bakhtin, it's this form that is like the cockroach. Like it's gonna survive, like it just takes on whatever the new style is, and it just adapts to it, and it sort of makes it its own. So I actually don't see it disappearing anytime soon. I think as a form of narrative, it's very powerful.
Well, even just beyond novel, just the idea of story, and just the idea of like I don't want to like go into like Joseph Campbell territory, but it's kind of like this ancient kind of impulse that human beings have to create stories and know themselves and each other through those stories. So the romance novel thing sounds like really, really like profitable for you, not in a market sense, but in an intellectual sense.
Yeah.
Did that like expand? Because I know you talk about like TV and movies. How did the romance novel lead to other places in terms of pop culture?
I think part of it was that when I was studying the romance novel, I was looking to see how it's represented in other forms of popular culture. So part of my dissertation chapter on the covers, I also looked at how TV shows like Friends TV shows like Dharma and Greg, most sitcoms will devote one episode, if not more, to making fun of the romance novel. Like, I think that's in some sitcom writer's handbook. Like, oh, we got nothing else, let's do an episode.
What elements do they make fun of?
Typically, it's actually what they think the romance novel is based on the cover.
Yeah.
So you'll often have like an episode. I'll give you a very concrete example. In Friends, at one point, Joey, Matt LeBlanc's character, finds a romance novel under Jennifer Aniston's mattress.
Yeah.
And so he spends the entire episode trying to enact what he thinks is happening in this romance novel. So he's like swaggering and he's like flirting with her.
This is in an attempt to like woo her, basically.
In an attempt to woo her,
yeah,
and embarrass her about the fact that she's reading about these episodes in her book, right? And so finally, at the end of it, she gets tired of what he's doing, and so she takes on the persona of like this seductive, I think like dairymaid or something like that,
wow.
And then like backs him up against a wall to the point where he's like, "I'm frightened. I don't know what you're doing." And so the whole thing is supposed to give you a sense of what romance novel episodes are like, though there is no connection at all. Like, this is completely imaginary romance novel that they're enacting, but it's
a
based on the
parody of
covers.
a non-existent,
so
or an erroneous idea of what the novel is.
Right, exactly.
We can go back to the covers thing, because there's a pile of someone always leaves a pile. I've actually posted pictures of them on Facebook because I find them fascinating. Someone left a pile of romance novels in the history department at Baruch, and they're like Native American themed, and they're like Native visions and stuff like that, and it's like these really hot like Indian dudes, like Native American, that are like, they look white, and they have like big muscles, and I mean it's just like and they're holding a damsel in distress kind of thing,
right?
Like, what is with that? Like, why is that such a trope?
Yeah, there's definitely there's a broad romance novel, and within it there are lots and lots of subgenres. And so the Native American romance is a subgenre that's, I think, been around, and it's very specifically U.S. based, right? It's like written by American authors. So of course the characters are Native American, but so it's not something that's come out of Britain. It's not something that I don't think anybody else around the world is writing.
Okay,
it's very specifically American writers are writing about this. They're read everywhere, of course, but so it's one specific subgenre, and honestly, I think part of it is that weird mix with which people treat minorities, which is like there's this desire to exoticize them because there's something so wonderful and powerful about their culture, right? Like, oh, spiritually you're better, or you have something that we destroyed.
There's some sort of authenticity there.
Right, there's an authenticity there, right? But also, I think similar to the whole project of Orientalism, which is that you're exotic and therefore you're more seductive, you're more sexy, but that of course confines you in that way. And so I think perhaps the Native American subgenre is the Americans writing what was the chic subgenre that the Brits were doing. So it's kind of a weird equivalent. And it's still around. I don't know how popular it is, but it's definitely still around.
Are these marketed and designed exclusively for women? Are these stories? Is that who's reading these?
Yeah, for the most part, the marketing is targeting women.
Yeah.
Is it just women who are reading them? Not quite.
Yeah.
But we don't have accurate data because it's harder to get men to admit that they read them.
And there's that secondhand economy you were talking about, where people are passing these things along.
Exactly. Yeah. So if it moves in a shadow economy, or if it's lying around at home because your female significant other brought them in, like, there's no way for us to track that unless
Joey and
men
Rachel
actually say that they're reading it. So yeah, I do have a colleague in DePaul University who's well known for writing on romance novels, who sort of talks about the fact that he's a romance reader, he writes on them, he likes reading them, but he also talks about the fact that he has a lot of culture capital. He's male, he's a professor, he has his degree, he's a poetry scholar, like, he doesn't have to be afraid of saying that he likes his reading, whereas for other men, it's instinctively already sort of marked. So they're definitely there, and we hear about them from time to time on message boards, because, again, you have the anonymity. You don't...
What's the message board thing? It seems like it was a part of your dissertation.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously this is an online community, but what are they discussing?
Well, it really does vary. Like, parts of it are just fan communities,
yeah,
right? So they're all sort of talking about this one author or this one book or whatever, sort of a version of Goodreads, I guess.
Yeah,
focused on
right,
that.
yeah.
There's also people who sort of nowadays write into certain blogs. So there are people who are doing blogging about romance in general, about particular books, about major controversies or something. And so people who are responding to that. But the bulletin boards were like the early, internet message board kinds of communities.
I'd imagine there'd be like some fan fiction too.
There probably is. I don't actually look at the fan fiction stuff, but I imagine there is. And my guess is that it's by and large for the really big name authors and novels. But otherwise, there's so much out there that Romance Writers of America and possibly even Harlequin, they were bringing in readers to become writers. Yeah. So you didn't have to be, in some ways, a fan fiction writer. You could just be a writer.
Yeah, right. Don't put that label on it.
Yeah, you could just straight up go ahead and publish. If that's what you were interested in doing, you could just write your own novel and go ahead and publish it if you had the caliber in terms of just writing.
So I don't know how much you'd be able to answer about this, but since I have a pop culture expert in front of me, I want to talk a little bit about where pop culture has gone in the last in our lives and since the 90s and since 9/11 there were like different kind of things going on and a few of them like one of them is like the explosion of like comic book and sci-fi and that kind of like nerding out of the culture, right? All of a sudden, there's that going on, right. And there's kind of I think underlying the pop culture of the last 10 years is this kind of rise in some form of feminism. Is that have you noticed that happening? I mean, I've seen you talk about Buffy, and I know you like regard that as a pretty big moment. Yeah. But where are women in this kind of like comic book explosion? Because it still feels very patriarchal and male to me in a lot of ways.
I agree. And I mean, the bummer, of course, is like in this past week, I'm sure you've seen that incident with the woman who's going to talk about video games at the university.
Sarkeesian. Yes.
And, the reaction to that. So
gamer culture.
The gamer culture and the issues with misogyny related to that. So I feel like in most things, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. I mean, I'm seeing...
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. I mean, there's progress in the sense that, you're seeing more writers in comedy, for example, right? Like Amy Poehler and Tina Fey and, there are people who are coming up and doing Mindy. Yeah, Mindy Kaling. What's her name? Amy Schumer. Yeah. So I think there's more women, and that's helpful. The more they occupy those spaces that writers have traditionally taken.
And not only that, but like to say, to recognize the 2 steps, as cynical as I am, those shows, like Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, or even Amy Schumer, they're talking about like women's issues on their shows. Like Amy Schumer's like just her show. I've only seen a few clips from it. It's incredibly crass.
It is,
But they're talking about like it's definitely from a like female perspective. Right. Yeah, and there's something really refreshing about that. Yeah. I think we are undergoing a little bit of a moment. With that. It's still very much, I don't know, they're all white girls, it's like, it still kind of reflects the overall prejudice.
Yeah, it is actually, culture, that's absolutely true. When I was trying last semester to find clips of female comics, and I had a hard time finding female comics of color, not because they're not out there, but because I couldn't find it online. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's like layers of difficulty accessing them. Yes. So first of all, whether they get to perform. Second of all, if somebody tapes them. And third of all, if it gets enough play for me to be able to find those things online. So I think there's definitely sort of layers of...
And it's also a thin line with like the minstrelsy and almost like a gendered minstrelsy because, you can have... and, I don't want to call anyone out specifically for it, but, like... someone, and I don't even know if she's a good example of this, but like Margaret Cho, like early in her career, like so much of what she's mining is like kind of like playing with her audience's ingrained kind of exoticization of Asians. You know what I mean? Yeah. So she has this like Asian mother character that everybody loves, and it's kind of like makes me feel really uncomfortable because she's playing this like minstreled out screaming Asian lady, and white people in the audience are just eating it up, and it excuses like their laughter because oh, she's an Asian lady saying it, so it's cool.
Yeah, and the fact that she is, while they're laughing, sort of being contemptuous about their laughter, doesn't really give us enough political power to cause change. So, yeah, I think there's definitely something there. But I admire women who are trying in whatever way. And one of the reasons I think romance novels are so powerful are because they've been so inherently a form written by women. So even though they've often been panned for like reinforcing old ideology or whatever, I still think it's women and they're writing to other women, and
Yeah.
they create spaces for women to discuss in whatever form that they're comfortable with the ideas of, being married, being in a couple, being, trapped in heteronormativity or heteropatriarchy or whatever. And I think that's the value of the form, that it's created this interesting base where it's okay for a woman to be producer of that idea, and women to sort of talk about that.
Yeah,
So,
no, I agree. I like your 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's really how I feel. I don't know if it feels like 1 step forward, 8 steps back in terms of the attitudes towards Arab people after 9/11. And you mentioned Orientalism, and like Said wrote that stuff in like the 70s, right? And so it's weird to notice it when 9/11 just like kind of created this hyper racist moment in American culture. How do you interrogate that stuff? Because 9/11 seemed like it happened right after you got here.
Right. Yeah,
right?
the year after.
Yeah.
The year after. Yeah, I talk about it a little bit in my book, and I have a chapter on war, and I talk about the way that we're dealing with sort of the exoticization of the, not necessarily just the Arab, but, enemy with a capital E,
Yes.
because we wanted the war on terror, whatever that was.
Right.
And so I think that there is an element of worrying about what the exotic other can do that's intensified. It's already been present. That's always been in the texts, right?
Yeah.
Like the exotic other is sexually powerful and attractive, and if you can somehow be in love with him, then it's fine. But till that moment, the threat is always there.
Yes.
And so after 9/11, I think actually what happens, to me at least, it seems like that threat became a lot more amorphous. So it wasn't actually like the Arab sheikh who was dangerous in that particular way. So it wasn't racist in that sense. It wasn't like you had more Arab evil villains, I don't think. But it became like they were all like mysterious enemies. And so you have like the rise of the paranormal romance subgenre, where sort of like along the Buffy vein, you had like possibly there were monsters out there.
Yes.
But at the same time, the genre is very interesting because it also doesn't like to take those stands because they're inherently opposed to its idea of love. And so a lot of the series that came out under the paranormal romance subgenre actually would like start with the premise that maybe there's a monster, maybe there's this mysterious enemy, and that by the end of the book you're like, no, that's actually kind of somebody like us, and we could actually get along, and you can fall in love with the enemy, and they actually aren't your enemy, and so forth. So there's actually very much a recuperative
like love
moment.
Transcending.
And to use it as a way to not panic that much.
Does that sound like love even transcending biological difference? You know what I mean?
Right.
In a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you've seen this movie, The Siege, from like many years ago. It's like with Annette Bening and Denzel Washington. And it's
I
like
haven't. No.
It reminds me because of what you just said, because Annette Bening's character is like an FBI agent that's trying to crack terrorism, but she's secretly like in love with her Arab informant guy who's just like really hot Muslim dude that they like have like hot sex. You know what I mean? And so it explores issues of terrorism through the romance.
Right.
And
that's interesting.
Yeah, I think you would.
I should definitely have a look at it.
Yeah. And it's right before 9/11, and it's just like I was watching it recently and just felt like, good Lord.
Yeah.
The way there's so much. I think you like. I love the stuff you study because it's like there is so much going on underneath stuff like that.
Yeah. And I think, the romance text is interesting because it's often in any form, not just a novel, but it's often treated as conservative, right? Like rom-coms are not as good because they maybe don't take as many risks. Like people always see the romance as this conservative form.
Yes.
But I think in this particular instance, its quote-unquote conservatism is useful because it stops at least its readers, or it tries to get its readers to not panic and to say like, you can't just like now certainly start assuming that anybody who's different from you, who's Arab, who's Muslim or whatever, is automatically trying to kill you. Right. Like you have to have a moment of thought and sort of try to find that moment where actually you could connect with that person. So I think they have a push and pull impulse, which is like the dialectic is like the main mode for romance novels to function. They're the same way about capitalism. They're the same way about these war and sort of race-based narratives.
Oh, well, speaking of race-based narratives, I feel like we're kind of witnessing one right now with the like Ebola scare, And how much do you think about like these stories because I felt like when I see people freaking out about that something from Africa is going to come infect me, despite the fact that there's no evidence that would happen.
Right.
I kind of feel like people like you that study what you study are kind of necessary because you have to understand the cultural narrative, and you have to understand like what that's about. Do you see all that pop culture coming out in the Ebola scare?
That's interesting. Sort of the threat of contagion and or unwilling connection.
Yeah. And apocalypticism and zombies, and it just feels like so convenient for Americans to fear this,
Yeah, to get freaked out by it. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I haven't really given it much thought. I think the paranormal romance subgenre is where some of those feelings kind of have been put. The idea of sort of collapsing, like your civilization is somehow under threat in one way or the other. And so you have elements of that idea, I think, coming into those series.
Well, it sounds like we're in an uncertain age, and you see that reflected in every level of the culture.
Yeah. And the paranormal has really gotten bigger and bigger. Like it's getting more of an audience. So I think that's possibly because it's sort of touching those cultural anxieties.
Do you mean like because when I think of a paranormal romance story, what pops into my head right now is Twilight. I don't know if vampires are paranormal. They fall into that.
Right.
But it seems like that what's important about that story is both the romance and the vampire aspect. I guess that's Buffy too, right?
Right. Yeah. I think it really does go back to Whedon, but a lot of romance readers will also point to Anne Rice and say that she's where that those stories sort of actually start.
Really interesting.
The vampire and the mixing of bodily fluids and the all of that, I think, possibly comes from there. But yeah, paranormal romance includes vampires, werewolves, everything that Stephanie Meyer took for Twilight is already there in the paranormal subgenre. But I'm also seeing different kinds of were-animals, so not just werewolves, but species that can turn from human to anything else.
It's getting really imaginative.
I see like angels, and a lot of people like take the fantasy element, so you'll get to see stories about like King Arthur's court, and like they exist and they have all these other powers.
Game of Thrones kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think a lot of the anxieties that you're talking about contagion and falling and all of that, those get fixed into that particular subgenre. Yeah.
Okay, we're almost done. I wanted to ask you another question about it's kind of obvious about the romance novel. I didn't ask. Like, what role does sex play in these stories? Because I've always, in my mind, I mean, I had a grandmother that had like 30,000 Danielle Steele novels on her, and I always kind of was like, is that my grandma's sex life? Is that what I'm witnessing? What's in those books? I always wondered, like, what's in those books, and why does grandma read them so much?
Did you ever read one?
No. But what's funny is my mom has gotten into them now.
Oh, has she?
So, as my mom gets older, she's like really into the Danielle Steele. And again, I'm kind of like, what's in there?
Yeah.
I mean, I did like pop open a few chapters, like a few like pages this summer, and it had that kind of like, he squeezed her bottom, like it's sexual, but it's kind of Victorian in a weird way. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like there's two different impulses there.
Right. Yeah. Well, a couple of things. For one, I don't think I'm in the minority to say this. Romance readers don't really consider Danielle Steele a romance novelist.
Okay. Yeah.
So she falls into her own genre, and that's, I don't know, I guess you could call it like women's fiction, or like the saga novel, because she often writes about like these families and like these generations of women.
Right.
And there's like a dynasty thing. Exactly. So she's a little bit in a category of her own. Like she's her own genre. Yeah, exactly. But as far as sex goes, first of all, again, to historicize, it's changed a lot. Like when I read the span of the books over the last 100 years, it's always been there. Even the ones that you would think, like, pre-World War I, they'd actually be super puritanical, and that's not true. You still have elements of sexuality in those books too. But those books are interesting because in some cases they will actually suggest queer narratives as well. So you might actually have the suggestion that there is queer desire, if not actually enacted, at least a suggestion of it is there in some of these books, and that actually sort of goes away in the middle of the century.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of like it reminds me of the documentary Celluloid Closet, which is the idea of like gay people having to kind of read deeply into the culture in order to recognize
to be able
themselves.
To pull those out. And then I think post World War II, in Britain at least, they start to become a little bit more sexual, but they become, I think, a little bit more explicit, I would say maybe in the 70s, late 60s or 70s. And in the British Mills and Boon publishing like tip sheet, they start to call the moment of the kiss, like there's something called a punishing kiss. So they actually like create this trope where that first kiss is very powerful, and it's clearly coming from the man to the woman. She's recipient of the desire. And so that's where the thing starts to shift a little bit, and it goes from being completely vanilla. Yes. It's just like, oh, we met, we fell in love, and they have like a nice chaste kiss on the last page.
Right.
To then you actually have the punishing kiss somewhere in the middle of the book. And so the sexual action actually starts somewhere there. They won't actually consummate till the end of the book. You don't even see that.
Rarely graphic, though, right?
Not at that point. Yeah, not at that point. It's very much as a suggestion. It's much more of a description of the woman's desire. Yeah. Because they're typically at that point written from the woman's perspective. Yes. So it's much more like how he makes her feel when he kisses her rather than what's actually happening.
That's amazing.
In the actual kiss. So it's much more internal than it is external. And I sort of coined this term for it because I didn't know what else to call it, called like sensuophilia. So the desire that she feels. Sensuophilia. So, in Laura Mulvey, when she discusses film, talks about scopophilia, right? The desire of looking at these people doing something. Whereas here, the desire for the reader is to understand what the person's feeling while they're enacting whatever their emotional and sexual lives are. And then I would say in the 80s, the 70s here in the U.S., the books start to become much more sexually explicit. So
that makes sense, yeah.
In about 74, 75, there's a book that comes out called Flame and the Flower by a woman named Kathleen Woody, who's a Minnesotan, by the way. And that's like one of the big historical romances. And that's where you start to later get the covers of the men who are bare-chested and so forth. And there you have much longer sexual scenes. You have like actual descriptions of the act of having sex, and it happens much earlier in the book than had been in the case in the previous one. So everything happens in some cases almost before they get married. So that's where I think
so. It's just like all of the rest of pop culture in a sense, and then the sexuality has become a little more explicit, but it doesn't necessarily mean our attitudes have changed that dramatically. I guess.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's more descriptive, and it becomes a question to some extent. I think of just like, well, if we're doing this, then the next time around we have to do this one more thing. So, and then there's a whole different thing called the erotic romance, which happens in the 90s, which has its own set of rules and its own...
And that accelerates the whole thing, right? Yeah. And it seems like another genre. It doesn't seem like the kind of like stereotypical housewife reading those, although maybe they are.
Yeah, I mean, the stereotype of the reader is sort of tricky because... people do think it's the housewives, but when I go to conferences, we often poll people, asking them, when did you start reading? And most people are like me. They started reading when they were 12. Yeah. So the stereotype of the housewife is a really strange one. Yeah.
It actually probably reflects my prejudices more than anything, right? It's kind of like, the Betty Friedan housewife somewhere, when it's actually a much more diverse community of readers.
Yeah. Very, in some cases, very young, and they read over a huge span of their lives. And you asked, what is the role of sex? To me, at least, the romance novel is, so far, really invested in saying that sexuality is a way to express true love. Right? Like they're really invested in that idea. Now, some people will call them conservative for that because they're confining it within two people. Often it's just one man and one woman and so forth. And that's changing. There's more books that are being written that people are calling romance that are ménage à trois, a multiple partner, open relationships, etc. But the mainstream romance really does believe that sexuality is just one more way of expressing love, and it really is going to be between this one person and this one person. They will not have that much sexual satisfaction with anybody else.
It's two steps forward, one step back, in a sense. Yeah. I know you teach a lot because you're at LaGuardia, but are you working on anything now? Like, where are you going now with this stuff?
Well, I just finished a book, which is sort of a reworking of the dissertation called "Making Meaning in Popular Romance Fiction."
Cool.
And so in that one, I was just looking at the way it deals with capitalism and with war, with heterosexuality, and with whiteness as one of its sort of constitutive categories to make meaning. How
Sounds
does meaning
awesome.
function?
Yeah.
I think it's fun. The next project that I want to tackle, so the first book was actually written all using the romance hero as my central sort of figure of study. The romance hero is capitalist, the romance hero is soldier, the romance hero is the straight man, and then the romance hero as the white man.
These are like the main actors in global politics.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
Exactly, which is why I sort of picked that.
That's cool.
But the next one, I think I'm going to be looking at romance heroines, and I'm trying to sort of theorize that, romance heroines get a lot of flack because one of the oldest critiques of them is that they don't know what they want. So they may say that they feel desire, and then they'll fight with the guy, or they'll say that they hate the guy, but they'll kiss him, right? Like there's people critique them for having this fundamental schism. And I'm trying to argue that that's actually a problem that the genre itself has, that it's trying to work out through the romance heroines, that romance novels are constantly being told, oh, you're too loose, sexually speaking, but you're very conservative in this other way. So they constantly get sort of told that they can be one or the other, and they're not doing either very well. So they're sort of trapped in this weird binary.
Yeah, and narrow paths on each side.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm trying to work out that idea through different kinds of romance heroines. So I'm trying to look at romance heroines and the way they deal with their nationality and how they're sort of pressured into taking on one national identity versus another, or one class identity versus another, or, So I'm sort of working out that idea using different
Sounds
heroines.
really great. Jayashree Kamble, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I had a lot of fun listening to what you do. It's good stuff.
Thanks.